Welcome everyone. I can see people joining the webinar today. That's fantastic. Just seeing the numbers go up, so I'll give it a minute or two. As you can see from the title slide, we're going to be talking about closing the retrofit skills gap today in this Retrofit Talks. I'm just going to set the scene a little bit about the context of the Retrofit 25 programme, of which this webinar sits under. So working with the National Retrofit Hub, the Building Centre, and I'm Laura Broderick, Head of Partnerships and Programmes there, have curated and organised an exhibition in the Building Centre on Store Street, all about the topics around retrofit and what's stopping us, the systems approach to various elements of retrofit and barriers that we need to overcome to improve the retrofit agenda at pace and scale. One of those 8 topics of the exhibition is around jobs. So today's webinar is one of 3 that sit under that overwriting retrofit and jobs piece, and the retrofit talk today is about closing the retrofit skills gap. So thank you all for joining. I can see the numbers going up some more, so it's fantastic that so many of you today could join in for this online event. As well as the exhibition, we've had in-person talks at the Building Centre in London and lots of other webinars. I mentioned this is part of a mini-series on the topic of jobs. We also have a webinar tomorrow lunchtime, if you can join that, and one next Tuesday as well. So do look out for those and do come and see the exhibition if you can. If you can't, it's now also up online as a virtual tour, so you can kind of dip in and out of those various themes and content and case studies on the Retrofit 25 What's Stopping Us pages of the Building Centre website. Okay, I think we've now got enough people joined the webinar to start properly. So I'm hosting today. I'm not actually speaking, you'll be pleased to know. So I'll be handing over to our esteemed panel shortly. But just to tell you more about the format of the panel and how it's going to run, we're going to have 20 minutes of focused presentation on the Retrofit Skills Gap report that our researcher Charlotte Ravenscroft produced for National Retrofit Hub, Gatsby Charitable Foundation and Ashden. So that will very much set the scene of what do we know about the retrofit skills gap at present through that research piece. And then we've got 3 speakers to come and sort of bring their personal perspectives, their professional perspectives about what they're doing in the industry on the retrofit piece and how they are overcoming some of the barriers around jobs and skills going forward. And then we'll have a Q&A with you, our audience. So you'll have a chance to put your questions to our panelists before we wrap up by 2. The event is recorded, so you will be able to see it on YouTube afterwards. So in a week or 2, we will publish that on the Building Centre's YouTube channel. So if you need to look back or share it with colleagues and friends, you can do that afterwards. So, right, without further ado, I'm going to ask all our panelists to come on camera so I can introduce them. So fantastic to see you all today. Thank you for taking part in this Retrofit 25 talk. So as I mentioned, we've got Charlotte Ravenscroft, who's an independent researcher and consultant, and she will be talking through the Closing the Retrofit Skills Gap report and thinking about the skills needed for a decarbonisation strategy and how further education colleges and others can achieve this. We'll then be followed by James MacLean, who's the head of training academies and innovation catalyst for Saint-Gobain. So thank you to James for participating. Then we'll hear from Dave Tiller, who's the technical training manager of Ventrolla, and he will be specifically talking about heritage and fenestration industry and the skills needed within that sector and how that all comes together. And then finally, we've got Jon Ackroyd, who's the managing director of Ackroyd Lowrie Architects, and he will be talking about what I presume is quite a unique process, which is the Ackroyd Lowrie Academy, designed to support architecture students and apprentices. So we'll be hearing from those panelists later on, but Charlotte's going to kick off. So I'll ask Charlotte to stay on screen and on mic. I'm going to stop screen sharing and I'm going to hand over to Charlotte. And then gentlemen, if you can come on when it's your turn to speak, that would be fantastic. So over to you, Charlotte.
Thanks very much, Laura. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. So I'm going to be sharing my research, which has actually gone across 2 different reports. I started this work last year as part of my master's dissertation and produced one report, and I've now followed it up with the second one, Closing the Retrofit Skills Gap. So just to briefly share what I'll be covering today, I'm going to start with a bit of the background, what my research found around the size and shape of the skills gap, a brief summary of the previous report, the first one that I did, and then I'll dive into the findings and the recommendations from my latest one. So I'm sure that everybody on this call already appreciates what a huge job there is ahead to retrofit the nation's homes, including the changeover to low carbon heating. The Climate Change Committee has said it's absolutely necessary to reach near complete decarbonisation of the housing stock if we're to achieve net zero. But today I'm focusing on skills, and when I'm talking about the retrofit skills gap today, what I'm talking about is the gap between the workforce that we have today and the workforce that we will need to decarbonise housing at this scale successfully. To look at that gap in a bit more detail, the Climate Change Committee looked at the retrofit skills needed in its 2020 Sixth Carbon Budget report. And this graph was their look at the delivery roles that would be needed. And they found that around 250,000 additional full-time equivalent roles would be needed. You don't need to see all the detail of the graph, but just to pull out a couple of things. The big rose band in the middle is heat pump installers. The dark grey at the very top is retrofit coordinators. The purple at the bottom is ventilation specialists. So they looked at a range of delivery skills, but in my research, I found that there are other forecasts that cover a much wider range of skills. And they put the forecast higher at more like 500,000 roles because they include the really important work that needs to be done in things like customer service, commissioning and planning, building inspection, and so on. But whichever of those, whatever the sort of ultimate number is that we're trying to reach, the important thing to know about the skills gap is actually the shape of this graph. And you can take two things away from the shape here. The first is that there's an assumption built in to a lot of our policy plans at the moment that we can rapidly scale up the skills that are needed to achieve building decarbonisation. And the second thing to take from it is that the Climate Change Committee in 2020 was assuming that this rapid rise would be well underway by now, 2025. In terms of where we are actually find ourselves in 2025, last summer when they took a look at this, they assessed that key skills were significantly off track to deliver retrofitting. Unfortunately, they only track one specific delivery role, which is heat pump installers. And at the time they looked at this last summer, they said it was significantly off track. We do think that a much wider range of skills need tracking. There is quite a good list that's been produced by Pippa Palmer of the key roles that are needed, and I'll pop a link in the chat to that afterwards. If we want to have more success in scaling up retrofit skills in the year ahead, firstly, we need to understand what's been holding us back to date. And so in my first research report, I did a literature review looking at lots of different studies over the past decade or so. And what I discovered, I've tried to summarize here in a single slide, was the vicious cycle of low retrofit skills. And so if you start at the top right-hand side, there are lots of studies that evidence the fact there's low customer demand for retrofitting. If you follow that round, that means there's low business investment in retrofit training because businesses aren't seeing the demand for it. Again, follow that round, that means that there's low take-up of training courses, and it's uneconomical for training providers, particularly FE colleges, to invest in developing those courses if there isn't going to be the take-up. Which means we have a workforce that has, over time, consistently had kind of insufficient levels of retrofit training in terms of the general construction workforce. What that means is that we have then a limited availability of really specialist contractors who are experienced working on retrofit, but we also have a really persistent problem with the retrofit performance gap, which is where there's the difference between the retrofit measures the how they're designed to work and how they actually perform in practice. That feeds back around to having low customer trust, finding it hard to find those specialist suitable contractors, and potentially high costs when you do want to contract with them. So that's kind of what I had found from looking across lots of different studies. There have been lots of different attempts to intervene in this market before by policymakers, but unfortunately without a lot of success. And I think when we do understand the skills system as a system, it helps us understand why that might be. So for example, the Green Homes Grant gave households vouchers to pay for retrofit measures. It was a government scheme a few years ago. And that creates a big boost potentially to demand. But we know that it ran aground in part, the NAO found, because of a shortage of skilled contractors. So although there was demand, we hadn't put in place the supply to keep up with it. There are other schemes where we've also seen kind of unfortunately real-world consequences of the lack of skills and also lack of quality assurance mechanisms. This is a recent news report about an earlier iteration of the ECO scheme. And we know that this creates real problems for residents if they have measures installed that aren't appropriate or that haven't been done correctly. And it's really important, of course, to maintain public confidence in retrofitting moving forward, that we don't have situations like this. So when I started looking into this, there was an interesting new development which was happening on the supply side of things instead of the demand side, which I'd found a lot of in the literature. There was a new intervention introduced in 2020 by the government to introduce local skills improvement plans. And the idea of those, they were set out in legislation, was to put employers at the heart of the skills system. The government contracted with employer representative bodies in each area of England to create a local skills improvement plan. And I wanted to take a look at those plans and see, what did they say about retrofit? Have they identified its importance in the different areas across the country? And a really significant point from, they're called LSIPs for short, is that FE colleges, further education colleges, are now expected to respond to the LSIPs when planning their provision. So what we would like to see, of course, is that retrofit skills are recognised as a high priority, and that would feed through to colleges making a significant investment in new training and there being a lot more take up for them. And I wanted to see whether that was the case. So I'll just pause for a second. So this is the summary of my findings from my first report. What I found was a fairly mixed picture. The main thing coming through the LSIPs that was relevant was, of course, what will be familiar to everybody on this call, I think, that there's a really significant labour and skill shortages in the construction workforce generally. And that is potentially a bottleneck situation for our ability to grow the retrofit skills workforce. But there are also specific issues, which were that most employers, the LSIPs largely reflect employers' views. And the LSIPs were saying that employers are not yet aware of net zero skills needs, and therefore they're not intending to take up training, or that they had a preference for as minimal training as possible so that they wouldn't lose time away from site. It creates kind of a mixed picture across England, where only a few LSIPs were identifying this as a real priority and planning to do something about those issues, and many others just reported on it or didn't even mention retrofit at all. And that meant, in my conclusion, that some areas in England were going to be further ahead and more ready to roll out retrofit at scale than others. I presented these findings to some of the to some experts around retrofit skills, and they found it really concerning because they were aware that this creates real risks for households of poor quality retrofitting, and they couldn't see how this was going to help us break through the kind of vicious cycle that I've talked about. So that was my report published last summer. I'm now going to turn to today's report that was published in March this year, and I'll put both links in the chat afterwards. So turning to the latest report, Closing the Retrofit Skills Gap, I was looking at a 1 year on reports. So the LSIP progress reports were published 1 year on from the original ones. And I wanted to speak to education providers on the ground. So I spoke to 9 FE colleges and a couple of independent training providers. And the idea was to see, I had already found what the LSIP said was going to happen, but we wanted to get a better view of what was happening 1 year on, and what the view was from the ground from FE colleges about how this was panning out. So I'll turn now to the findings. So interestingly, the LSIP progress reports that were published did indeed show this really rapid rise in demand for retrofit skills. And I'm using a few kind of illustrative quotes here, but if you go to the reports, you'll see a lot more. So a lot of them did highlight that the government retrofit schemes had created a rapid demand increase, but they also again noted the competing demands on the construction workforce. And so that labour shortage is a big issue that intersects with our ability to grow retrofit skills. There is better news. Of the 34 progress reports I looked at, 24 were doing something now about retrofit skills, which was a significant increase on the original LSIPs. I'll turn to what they were doing. Firstly, a lot of areas had been investing in new construction training facilities because the LSIPs had an associated funding stream alongside them, which provided capital funding. And so they're, like in Kent, that this quote is from, there are new retrofit training centres being developed around the country, many of which that have been built over the last year or so. The funding hasn't covered everything that the colleges need. So we know that some have also partnered with manufacturers to get access to equipment like heat pumps. And we know that for independent training providers, they've not generally been able to access the same capital investment. So it's mainly been FE colleges where these new training facilities are available. And that is really important because we know we do need facilities and space to host learners doing practical hands-on training. In terms of the actual courses that colleges have been offering so far, several I spoke to said that even though they had built these new facilities, they were doing very little so far in terms of courses because there wasn't yet much demand. For those that were doing some delivery, they were focusing on very short introductory courses or short installer courses, or the PAS 2035 roles, particularly the retrofit coordinator courses. And so some colleges were delivering those in partnership with external providers as well. The concern that I had based on my conversations with experts about retrofitting is that these very short courses are sometimes not adequate for people to become proficient in new techniques and technologies, especially if they aren't actually going on to deliver this work on site on a regular basis. So even though colleges have built these new facilities and started offering some courses, there isn't yet this massive upskilling effort to upskill the existing workforce. And that's despite the ongoing rollout of the Warm Homes Scheme and other government incentives and schemes. And so that to me suggests that there are potentially some quality risks that remain, and certainly risks in terms of meeting that trajectory that the Climate Change Committee wanted to see in terms of a steep increase in these skills. Over time, what retrofit experts say we really need to do is not just to be upskilling the existing workforce, but training up all new entrants to the workforce from the outset. And when I spoke to colleges, only a very small number were actually doing this so far. Those that were doing it were trying to integrate building physics content and sustainability content into all of their like level 2, level 3 construction courses, all of their apprenticeships. But it was just a couple of examples across all of the interviews that I did, and I had selected those interviewees because I knew that they were the most advanced in the country. So this is what experts have said is needed, but so far very few colleges are being able to do that. And so what is it that's holding other colleges back from doing this? The first thing that colleges were very quick to say is it's very hard to find experienced tutors on these topics. You can see a couple of quotes here illustrating that. And the key issue is just the pay disparity with industry, but also retention's an issue. Secondly, there are issues around the accreditation of new courses and courses that have been developed not keeping pace with new technology and things like changes in the building regulations. But by far the biggest issue that I come back to and that the colleges came back to in talking with me was that employer interest remains quite low. And so it's really having a limiting effect on the upskilling of the construction workforce. And it makes it uneconomical for colleges to invest more in tutors and in developing resources to teach retrofit more widely. There's also issues that came through in the progress reports, like the quote you can see here, with employers not currently offering enough apprenticeships and T-level work placements. And so that's also a constraint on the skilling up of new entrants to the workforce at this time. So it presents, although there is some progress within colleges, it still presents quite a challenging picture. So I'll just again pause here on the summary of our findings. And finally, I'll turn then to the recommendations. So from both reports, I was making policy recommendations aimed mainly at central government. And so in those, I have recommended, particularly, I would draw everyone's attention to the second one, that what we really need is more coordination of interventions so that when we're boosting demand, that is government schemes and incentives to boost demand for retrofitting, we are also simultaneously making it more possible to supply those skills training opportunities, both supporting employers to do that and supporting colleges and training providers to offer them, and having a mechanism to ensure quality. So the next recommendation down is all about quality, is saying actually we need to make it mandatory for the workforce that are delivering retrofit schemes, particularly for the government, for them to have access to appropriate training. Continuing down my list, we think that all construction qualifications need to integrate building physics and sustainability content, because until that's done, and that's a core part of the qualifications, it's hard for colleges to kind of add that on. We recommended using public procurement to try and boost the number of apprenticeships and T-level work placement. And we advocated for stronger funding and support for FE colleges, particularly to help them recruit and retain tutors. And the idea is ultimately that if we can have much more focus and coordination around this kind of system, the whole system view, I'm just coming back to that diagram from earlier, and intervene to coordinate interventions on the demand side, the supply side of skills courses, and on the quality side to make sure that the public can have confidence in measures that are being delivered in their homes, That's how we're going to get on top of the retrofit skills gap, and that's how we're going to ultimately maintain public confidence in the workforce and the kind of retrofitting journey ahead of us. So that's it from me, Laura. I'll hand back to you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. Obviously, there's a lot at play here, isn't there, about making the sector fit for the future and that upskilling existing workforce and training new people as well. So a lot at play. So thank you so much for setting the scene and sharing your research findings. And just a reminder before I move on to our next speaker, the Q&A section we'll do once all our speakers have presented. So we'll do it collectively as in a panel conversation. And the way to put your questions to the panel is through the Q&A chat box function, which you will see at the bottom of your screens. So those of you who do have questions for Charlotte, by all means, think of them, put them in the chat box, but we'll put them to Charlotte at the end of all the presentations. Okay, so we're going to move on now over to James to speak as our kind of second speaker, first panelist. And James, we've given him less time than Charlotte. So if you think James is quick, that's how we briefed him. So I'm handing over to James now. Thank you, James.
Hi, everybody. I'll just share my screen. So I'll just introduce myself first. So yeah, I'm James MacLean. I'm head of training academies for two of Saint-Gobain brands in the UK, the British Gypsum and Easter brand. But I also do a lot of work with some of our other brands, which I'll talk about as we go through this presentation. So if you are unaware, Saint-Gobain are a construction product manufacturer. As a business, the company's over 360 years old. And then within the UK, we own several construction product brands, including British Gypsum and Easter, who I work for. We have Weber, Ecofon, Killwater Minerals, who were a recent acquisition, and we'll be talking through those as we go through the presentation. But as Saint-Gobain, our core purpose as a business is to make the world a better home, and really retrofit is probably the greatest way that we can deliver on our purpose. But that's not just about making and selling products that make homes warmer, healthier, cheaper to run, but by being able to support communities to make these improvements themselves, to leave a legacy of skilled operatives behind who will hopefully, obviously, close the retrofit skills gap and also the general skills gap within construction. But because it's within the communities, making the difference in their own communities. As part of that, our academies aim to upskill the industry, raise the competence out within industry, and hopefully inspire people to come into the construction industry and the retrofit sector. And that helps us to sort of deliver on that promise through our training offer to make the world a better home. And we really want to embed retrofit expertise into every touch point, from design through to installation, to really speed up the transformation of existing homes into healthy, comfortable, energy efficient homes, but still engaging with local community and residents. And our long-term retrofit strategy is not just the immediate delivery of retrofitted properties, but it's around that sort of long-term impact of people having warm, healthy homes. And we do that generally through our academy network. Across the UK and Ireland, we have 11 academies, 8 based on the mainland of the UK. And between all those different academies, we train over 4,000 people a year, not necessarily on retrofit solutions, but obviously those brand-specific solutions through some of the brands that you see on the screen, from Ecofon through to Killwater and their care systems. Between all the different brands, we have 50 plus courses available that people can attend, and 25 plus e-learning modules, which also includes access to some of the supply chain sustainability skills e-learning modules as one of their partners. And outside of that, we also support 65 colleges across the UK, traditionally around plastering and dry lining, but we're also looking at opportunities how we can expand that support to cover retrofit skills like glazing, internal wall insulation, external wall insulation, etc. But we're probably within industry the largest and longest standing network of manufacturer-led construction training centres. We've been delivering training to industry for, well, as of next year, around 60 years. And so we've got a lot of experience in terms of training delivery. And that means that we're obviously well supported or well placed to support the retrofit skills and training needs, not just of those already working in industry, but those looking to come into industry and to support the attraction of that talent into the retrofit industry. And below the K-Rend and K-Systems brand, you'll see reference to a training partnership that we set up in North Wales called Tigwynfai. That is something that some of my colleagues are going to be talking about in another webinar in a couple of weeks, but I will make reference to it a little bit as we go through, because it's a really good example of industry working with housing association and also tying in with the local FE and HE education facilities in the area to really deliver retrofit skills. So there's sort of 4 areas that we look to support retrofit training across the UK and Ireland. Firstly, as I mentioned previously, is around that upskilling of people already in that industry, whether it's installers, supervisors, coordinators, etc., around our retrofit solutions. But also a big part of it is looking at how we can support people into that industry, and that can be through attending local career events and supporting charity events. Excuse me. We also obviously form a lot of key partnerships with colleges. I just talked about on the last slide around what we do with colleges around plastering and dry lining and what we want to expand into retrofit. But we're also starting to support the development of those lecturers in college who are being asked to deliver retrofit skills now in terms of moisture management, building physics, and then obviously looking at generally IWI, EWI, glazing solutions, upskilling them on those solutions. So obviously they're more confident on passing that knowledge onto their learners. We provide access to e-learning, whether that's stuff from the Supply Chain Sustainability School or e-learning that we've created that can support that knowledge. And we like to get involved with masterclasses, and this is something that we've been doing initially through the partnership in North Wales, where as well as training the lecturers, we also deliver masterclasses to the students. And then looking at how we can support within the community as well. So, you know, a big part of retrofit is about that communication piece with tenants, whether that's through the tenant liaison officers or directly to the tenants. So looking at how we can run sessions, whether you want to call them masterclasses, to tenants so they can see some of the solutions that are going to be installed on their properties to make them warmer and healthier, and maybe even spark an interest again involved and becoming part of the retrofit revolution, and you know, learning those skills to be able to support their own communities. And then finally, the 4th area is looking at what we can do to support qualifications. So whether that's supporting those already working in construction to gain retrofit qualifications through on-site assessments, through the MVQ or SVQ process, support the development of retrofit qualifications, but also quite importantly as well, support the development of CITB training standards linked to retrofit to support funding for, again, people already working in the industry to get those additional skills that they need to access retrofit projects and jobs. On this slide, we've just got some examples of some of the things that we've done with colleges, college lecturers. There was a Women in Construction event that we supported where we did demonstrations and allowed them to have a go at installing their tightness membranes, tapes, etc., but also external wall insulation. And then finally, in terms of how we feel the skills gap closes, it links very closely to obviously what Charlotte talked about in her sort of last slide, really. Key is those strategic partnerships where not just bringing manufacturers together with colleges, but also bringing in other parts of the supply chain to support the development of those either wanting to come into retrofit or already training to be part of the retrofit sector. Obviously, we need to do that by supporting FE colleges, whether that as a manufacturer, that's the donation of material to facilitate training, whether that's the creation of learning resources that colleges can use, but also obviously the development of the staff and the trainers working within colleges. And something that I totally agree with Charlotte from her report is making it mandatory that all construction and technical qualifications have that standalone retrofit unit, so everybody has that overarching knowledge when they work in construction about retrofit. And then finally, the mandated training and CPD for anybody that's working within retrofit to make sure they're keeping their skills up to date. They're up to date with changes in legislation, changes in manufacturers' recommendations, etc. And that's it. I'll hand you back to
Me, to Laura.
Laura.
Hi, James. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate the retrofit revolution phrasing that you used then, because, you know, that's what most people on this call will be about. So it was really sort of good to hear that phrase used. So thank you, James. So we're going to lead on to our next speaker. So I'm going to invite Dave to come on mic and camera and to share his screen. So over to Dave Tiller from Ventrolla.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon to you. Just to give you a brief update on who I am, actually. I'm Dave Tiller. I've worked in the fenestration industry for some 44 years now, and Ventrolla for the last 16 years. How do I get this? I'm sorry. Yeah. So just a brief introduction on Ventrolla. Ventrolla have actually been retrofitting timber windows in historic buildings and housing stock for the last 40 years. The product was designed in Harrogate, which is where we employ 110 employees. We have additional workshops in Scotland, Bristol and Oxford. We do operate nationally. We work on National Trust buildings, Crown estates, royal households, etc. So the list goes on. Our signature technology is our proven draft proofing system. It's a very easy system, but when you look at these old windows, when they were produced, they didn't have a draft proofing system. So even putting the draft proofing system in these old windows, which, as you know, listed buildings, you're limited to what you can and can't do. So even getting a 30% improvement on the U values, etc., it goes a long way to improving the heat retention in these properties. The discrete design of our SRS system allows the sashes to be taken out. So what we do, in fairness, we look at what we can do with the draft proofing system and improving these windows now. And to be fair, we look at the improvement of the draft proofing, and opening and closing these windows is so important. We go to lots of buildings where they suffer from incredible damp and kids have respiratory problems, etc. And that's because they're not purge ventilating the properties. So we're very big on this and making sure that we make these homes healthy. So closing skills gap, we do educational talks. So we're raising awareness and possible career paths in the industry. We are working closely with the Bury St Edmunds Town Trust on the building conservation trade course, which is being worked on in conjunction with English Heritage. So we're looking at rolling these courses out across the country. So we are taking and we have been for the last several years. In fact, I've been conducting these lectures, and it's quite interesting that when you do this, the guys that are doing their apprenticeships or joinery apprenticeships, when you add this course, it actually enlightens them to thinking that they were just going to stay in a factory building chairs or cabinets. Nothing wrong with that, but to give them the insight of these different facets of what we actually do is quite rewarding. Apprenticeships, we have hands-on training and apprenticeships. So a lot of our apprentices in the factory we take on from Harrogate College, and the progression into full-time employment is is quite a high area. So we have a number of apprentices that are full-time employed now, but have gone through the apprenticeship scheme. The REBA approved CPDs, majority of my time, I must admit now, we're trying to relieve that a bit more, is doing CPDs across the country. And we find that face-to-face CPDs are more encompassing, so we get a lot of feedback. And we've actually started something this year that has gone down really well. We've started round tables. So we've started to try and unite and drive debate on solutions. So for argument's sake, in York, we had several conservation officers, town planners, people in the industry that talk about the constraints of upgrading the windows so we can go some way to meeting net zero 2050. And what we did find is the lack of knowledge actually between some conservation officers. So a lot of conservation officers we found that were saying that they needed a bit more knowledge of what could be done. So the CPD that we produce and send out has gone down really well. And to be fair, if I'm honest, I thought the first round table might be a bit chewy, as in people a bit angry about some things, but it was very good. And what it did show is collectively, if you get people that have a common cause, there is a way through this. So raising awareness of innovation in window restoration. I mean, we have the oldest housing stock in Europe. We have over 10 million properties that are built prior to 1944, 400,000 listed properties, and 2.9 million properties in conservation areas. So you can clearly see there's a big market to go at, which we do try and cover, but we do commercial and domestic, but the skill gap is now holding us back a bit. So you can see from this, the slide one is from Jake. So the guy on the left is an actual apprentice going through the scheme. The guy on the right, Matt, he is a guy that's gone through the scheme and is now full-time employed, and he's sharing his skills and passing those on. So we have several apprentices that we look after currently. And a little statement at the bottom there is a personal statement from me. And generally what it's saying is, if we don't look at doing these talks and supporting colleges and supporting, as Charlotte said, you know, all these facets that we can do, we're going to struggle. And these lovely buildings on the heritage side are going to suffer. And once we lose these buildings, we've lost them forever. So, and just to name drop now, and I don't mind doing this, but we were working on the Crown Estate last week, and on a property that I can't say, but King Charles actually came in and spoke to the lads, and one of the main lads he spoke to was the young trainee that we had on the tools, and his main interest was what are Ventrolla doing about bringing youngsters into the industry, and to be fair, talking about the skills gap. So it's very topical. So to close on a nutshell, open opportunities to close the skill gap. I think at Ventrolla we'll explore any avenue to try and drive this forward. I mean, like I said to you guys, or a couple of guys before we started this, I'm 65 years young, and I'm not getting any younger, but the skills gap, or the aging workforce in skills, is unbelievable. It's just not window heritage, it's thatching, it's lead work, it's stained work, etc., etc. I could go on with the list. So anyway, I'll hand over to, I hope you found it interesting.
Definitely, Dave. Thank you so much. And those images you shared are great. I love seeing the action shots. And for anyone who wants to learn more about that process, there is actually a video of Ventrolla's apprentices working in the factories, learning the skills, learning about the warm homes issues, learning about how to improve the environment through the window upgrades. So that is a video that's in the building centre currently in the Retrofit 25 exhibition. So you can come and see that and learn more about Ventrolla's work that way. But before I move on, just a reminder, you can use the chat box for your questions. If it is for a specific person, please do put who it's for. So when we get to that section of the event, I'll know who to address it to. But for now, I'm going to hand over to our final speaker, to Jon Ackroyd. So over to you, Jon.
Thank you, Laura. Just get my presentation up. So I'm Jon Ackroyd, co-founder and managing director of Ackroyd Lowrie, talking today about the Ackroyd Lowrie Academy we set up about 6 years ago. So this was a realization of need to kind of improve skills in our team and sort of bring different people into the industry. We're a practice of about 25. We specialize in retrofit and regeneration projects. So we're doing a lot of work in this sector. And we came from a background of sustainability, and we're kind of very aware of really, we're not quite hitting the targets that Charlotte talked about earlier. We're not actually delivering on the retrofits, and the ones we do are very complicated and actually need a lot of different types of skills. Just one example, when we were thinking about this is a kind of big retrofit of an existing building, and we were doing this 5 or 6 years ago, and it involved underpinning, propping, all sorts of things that are really technical, and we weren't necessarily well skilled as architects to do it with our traditional training. I'd actually gone back and trained as a carpenter previously, and that kind of got me thinking about trying to bring kind of more hands-on experience into the office. Again, other kind of big technical challenges like kind of facade retention and different types of technical challenges, all very different buildings. So a lot of building physics and technical knowledge needed. And again, this is one we're just doing at the moment, taking a kind of concrete frame existing building and completely reimagining it. The sort of myriad of different technical challenges you get in these buildings are quite large, and so we were thinking, how do we develop ourselves? And that's really where we came up with the Ackroyd Academy, because we realized architecture school was not really giving any practical experience of the real world, and that was challenging for us. There's a big gap. But more than that, we felt that, you know, those staff that were already progressed, they needed more hands-on training. And our practice is all about kind of future cities. And we see retrofit being a really important part of that, having a kind of interesting pattern of history that kind of ties our cities together. And that actually has a kind of wider connection to the communities that they serve. At the moment, architecture is an incredibly expensive profession to train in. It can cost you up to £100,000 a year. And we were thinking, how can we kind of move away from that? We started to develop an in-house system with modules and processes, which is quite good. And we then developed that and worked with the Hackney schools, which are local to our office in East London. At the start, that was really just sort of work experience for them. It didn't really have a program, and that was a little bit, we wanted more effectively. So we then tied up with New City College, who've been amazing. Jane Nugent there has managed to get all sorts of different people here. And what we've done with New City College is it works both ways. We have a program of apprenticeships to take people through all the way from basically T levels or kind of equivalent of A levels, all the way through to being fully qualified as an architect without having to raise debt, basically through the apprenticeship programs with different levels of qualification that take you through. So that allows kind of different people from different backgrounds who wouldn't necessarily want to take on the debt that's associated with it, but it also gives you loads of practical experience. And at the end of that, we also in-house kind of move on and do the kind of the retrofit designer and coordinator training for kind of more senior. So there's a kind of whole lifetime of different types of training there. but the focus was on the younger people. So this was our first cohort. We've taken 6 students per year. They come 2 days a week for about between 2 and 6 months. And then this is Rashik, who's working with us. That's on the website. He's an employee now. So that's with him a couple of years ago on the left-hand side. That's him now working with us as an architectural assistant and doing his degree course that we're supporting. So that for us has been a really exciting journey and a satisfying one as well. Bad news, though, only about a week ago, the government decided to pull some of its funding and support for the apprenticeships program for level 7 for those over 21. So there are challenges out there. So the government's asking us to do one thing, which is do more retrofit, but then is not always supporting it. So a challenge for us. But we are looking to support that ourselves and with partners. So it's not all bad news. And I think for us, we see it as kind of doing the small things that matter. You know, great things are not done by impulse, but by a series of small things brought together. And I think that was an important part for us. And actually, through this program, we've developed a new kind of retrofit of a organic farm over in Dagenham. It's a pro bono project. The students built all the models, worked with the local team from Growing Communities, the project that did it, and we're developing that, and that's going to go on site hopefully next year, and actually there'll be hands-on building for the team. So for us it's been really beneficial. Great to get the government to support more, but I think I'd encourage others to look at how in the real world they can do their little bit and bring in people, and it's very rewarding. Thank you very much. If you've got any questions, let me know.
Thank you, Jon. Such great examples and really highlighting that point about that upskilling the existing workforce, including architects, etc. You know, you said you've had to learn a lot in the projects you've been delivering, through to getting young people inspired for construction architecture courses, but also learning those green skills, learning the sort of retrofit language, and yeah, being ready to sort of deliver that in the future. So fantastic. Thank you, Jon. If all of our speakers could come on mic and camera now, that would be fantastic. We've got just under 10 minutes for a bit of a discussion for your questions. So again, reminder, please put your questions in the Q&A box and we can have a chat through. But just to kick off, and you don't all need to answer, so jump in if you feel strongly about it. Retrofit 25 is all about what's stopping us. You've obviously talked through research, Charlotte. You've talked about lived experience professionally, Dave, James, Jon. But what do you think might be the one big thing that's stopping us? I know, Jon, you've mentioned funding being pulled from some of the apprenticeships, but anything else that you want to share?
Can I pop in? I think from our point of view is the inconsistency of decision makers and people like conservation officers, building control. There's products out there to enhance to U values of windows, for argument's sake, but people are not allowed to use them. But they are in some areas and they're not in other areas, because building control or conservation in one area says yes you can, and in another I think there needs to be a general consistency of whether that's government led, that everyone can follow a blueprint on what's acceptable.
Well,
yeah, I fully agree. Sorry, Laura.
You go, Jon.
No, I fully agree, Dave. I mean, like the amount of different requirements in different places and different levels of understanding is a real problem. And I think, you know, there is places like the City of London, Corporation London, they've got a great sustainability policy, really strong on retrofit first, and they're kind of really promoting it, but other boroughs are not so good. I think there is work on a national retrofit standards going on. I think there's a paper out. I can check the details, but I think it is fundamental because it's so difficult. It's hard enough anyway because every building's different, and then if you've got every local authority and different legislation not talking together, it's harder to get through those hurdles and to kind of communicate a narrative about bringing back a building into kind of better use or improved use.
And on the skills piece, Charlotte, you said when you've been doing your research and your deep dive into what's happening across the country, there were some pockets of amazing best practice, and you know, it's that inconsistency as well from that sort of skills delivery, right? Or have I misinterpreted that? Is that?
Yeah, no, you're totally right. I think for me, exactly what you guys are talking about is we need the coordination. So we've got like high quality standards for what a great retrofit looks like, and that then feeds through to the courses covering the right content. so that the people who do them are then equipped to deliver that, and having that all work nicely together so that the planners and the commissioners are commissioning the right things. You know, because they're clear what the good standards look like. It all needs to go together. And the problem for me is that we're looking at separate parts of the system all separately, and it's not joining up very well.
The silos again, right? Yeah, and getting that systems piece working, which I know obviously National Retrofit Hub and others are doing a lot on. So great. All right, then let's go to audience questions. So there's a couple for you, Charlotte. So the first is around. Oh, hang on. Let me just read it out verbatim. So, is there a risk that retrofit installation will slow down if the government enforces training courses for contractors before they can start installations? So it's like the programming piece, I suppose. Yeah.
Yes, there could be a risk that it slows down a bit, but on balance, given the risks to tenants, if their retrofit is not done well to a high standard, we're talking about risks of damp, mold, health issues. It's more important, I think, that, you know, I would want for my house and my children to know that anyone coming in to work on it was properly trained. And so having a bit of time to make sure everybody has accessed up-to-date recent training, because even though we know there's lots of great people out there in the workforce that maybe have had years of experience doing this, actually some of the technologies have changed, you know. So we talk about heat pumps, we talk about the latest in sustainable building materials. We also talk about some heritage techniques like Dave mentioned, and it's making sure people have got the right skills for the part of the project that they're working on, so that essentially tenants and residents of whatever housing tenure type are confident about the work that's being done. So I think essentially the risks are unacceptably high for us just to say, let's go on and keep trying to install measures, because we've seen what's happened on spray insulation. You know, we've seen what's happened, unfortunately, with some projects where the external wall insulations led to issues with mold and so on. So for me, on balance of risks, I'd rather slow down a bit and make sure everyone has appropriate recent training.
Does anybody else want to jump in on that, or you don't have to, but just to give you
I just want to really echo what Charlotte's just said. You know, I think it's a sacrifice that we need to make, is to go slower to ensure that we're not making people's homes worse than they already are. There's no point turning what is a cold house into a warm house, but then have more growth within 6 months.
Yeah, and we don't want to retrofit the retrofits, do we? So
Exactly. Double the cost.
Okay, great. I'm going to move on to another question. The recommendations from your report, Charlotte, were aimed at central government. What does Charlotte and the rest of the panel think can be done at the regional level, for example, through combined authorities, to close the skills gap and boost supply chain capacity? Yeah.
I'll jump in there. I'm actually doing my next report is about what combined authorities can do. So please, if anybody on the call is working with a local authority that's also thinking about that, I'd love to talk to you. But one thing, I already had a chance to talk to the employer representative bodies, which are kind of the local bodies running these skills plans across the country. And what I was mainly saying to them, which I think one of the other speakers picked up on, James, I think, was form these strategic partnerships. Make sure you've got a group where you're bringing together the colleges, the local kind of employers that are specialists in this area, and the council that are thinking about how to roll out the retrofit schemes locally, particularly the warm home scheme in social housing. Get these people together and start the conversation, because I think we need to make sure there's that join up, so that the skills plan properly reflects what the councils need in terms of the rollout in their area.
Yeah, the joined up piece. Yeah. Okay, great. We're running out of time, but we've got 2 more questions in, so we're going to get to those ones, and then we'll have to say our thank yous after that. So this question is around the role of awarding bodies, accreditation and monitoring being... Sorry, what do you see the role of awarding bodies, accreditation and monitoring being for advancing quality training in the sector? And how can we ensure courses provided are future-proofed and place-based and not reactive? I think you answered some of that a little bit, Charlotte, talking about that LSIP bit being joined up. But do you want to say more on that, or would anyone else like to contribute? Dave, you said you worked with some accreditation courses, and
Yeah, I think we sort of we're joined up here. We need to make sure that everyone's singing from the same hymn sheet. And whilst we're doing these building conservation trade courses and lectures, we need to make sure that we're not duplicating it. And there's a common ground where people join together and get these going. It's so important that people get on the bus. We found that just to give you an idea, we found that Worcester Council, we did a talk there on a CPD presentation to councillors there, etc., and conservation officers, when the conservation officers weren't even aware what they could do. So they were actually signing off work that arguably they shouldn't have been done in areas, but the inconsistency, I think, these courses can bring people together. And it's not just the younger people, it's the people that, maybe 25, 30, and I'm not being ageist, but looking at those, maybe more mature people as well as there's a whole raft of people out there to bring in to these industries.
Right.
Yeah,
And
I think if you, sorry, Laura, was that right to?
Yeah, you go.
No, I think absolutely, and I think it's really interesting here from different people here, because I think we sit in our silos. I think architectural education is quite in its kind of, ivory towers, separated away from actually anything that's built, and then you've got contractors building things, and you've got manufacturers, you've got other people, and I do think with retrofit, it needs a bit more, even more than new build. It needs more kind of coordination between those different people. So I think when we're talking about bringing people together, the training always seems to be done sort of separate. And I do think, like in the real world, we all have to kind of actually get the products to fit in and together and work with the guarantees and all the rest of it and design it. So I do think a bit more kind of joined up thinking would be good. And if the local authorities and or say the GLA could encourage that and kind of look to harmonise standards across, and I'm talking regulatory standards, but harmonise that with training, it would definitely I think could help ease the complexity of getting these projects delivered with more skills.
Great. Thank you, John. Just quickly, we are over time.
Okay.
Any idea of how it compares to other countries? I'm assuming the retrofit skills gap is the is the point being made. How does our retrofit skills gap compare to other countries? Charlotte?
I would refer you to Gavin Killip's work and Linda Clark's work. They're two academics that have looked quite extensively, particularly Linda Clark's looked at other EU countries. And just in a real nutshell, in several other European countries that have less of a problem with this issue, it's because they have longer initial training. So like you become a sort of master tradesperson at the start of your career, having trained in multiple trades, whereas in England, at least, we tend to specialize very early on. So you do your training and you're doing a plastering or bricklaying of training, and we specialize in those individual trades very early on.
Yeah, so that broader understanding of
how a whole building works is really critical to the other courses in other countries.
Oh, interesting. Well, thank you for sharing that. And thank you all for being on the panel today, and Charlotte for setting the scene, and then Dave, James and John for sort of bringing your experience to the table. So appreciate you all making the time for this webinar. And thank you to our audience for joining. Apologies, I will have to wrap up and say goodbye, but it is being recorded and will be on our YouTube channel shortly. And we've got more webinars. So we've got one tomorrow lunchtime on this retrofit and jobs and the skills piece again, and then another one next Tuesday where Saint-Gobain are talking more about their partnerships in action. So yeah, more examples of this working and what we can do to prevent the stopping us piece and move forward. So thank you everyone, and yeah, look forward to seeing you again. Bye-bye.
Cheers, guys.
Thank you all. Cheers.
Everybody.
Bye.